This time it's 5 classic British bikes with engines of under 250cc. For many years in Great Britain, it was a tax advantage to have an engine of less than 200cc, which is why Aiel would sleeve down its Arrow 2-stroke during the mid-60s in an effort to boost sales, and Villiers post-war would not produce an engine over 197cc for a number of years. And so here are 5 classic sub-250 motorbikes. The BSA Bantam 175. The original RT125 based BSA Bantam was introduced in 1948 as the rigid rear end D1 model. But realising they were onto a good thing, in 1953 they introduced the D3 Major with its 150cc engine. But 1955 would see the first 175cc version of the engine in the D5. This model was actually only produced for a year and was replaced by the D7 Super, which had a swinging arm frame. And this would remain until 1966 in the introduction of the D10, which as the name suggests produced around 10 horsepower, but problematically still only had a 3-speed gearbox. This would be remedied just 2 years later with the introduction of the D14-4 with a 13 horsepower engine and at last 4 speeds. Now to gain the extra power on the D14, they'd increased compression both in the crankcase and also at the top end. This could make the machine surprisingly difficult to start for such a small bike, although it did give it excellent performance of around 65 miles an hour. But even this was not the ultimate version. This came in the form of the B175, also available as a Bushman model. This featured a revised bottom end, as well as a new cylinder head with central plug and a greater squish area, making for more efficient running. Overall, the B175 was a match in performance terms to the D14, but was smoother and easier to live with, and perhaps a nice way for the Bantam to bow out. The Triumph Tiger Cub. For many years, the Tiger Cub was the only single-cylinder machine in the Triumph range. There had been a 350 for a short period post-war, but this had quickly been phased out in favour of the 3T parallel twin. The Tiger Cub was a development of the earlier Terrier model, which just had a 150cc engine. This had been produced between 1953 and 1956, with the 200cc Cub following in 54, just a year after the Terrier, because Triumph realised fairly quickly that the engine was just that bit too small. Over the years, the Cub came in many forms, but throughout the engine was a unit construction, overhead valve motor of 199cc, with a bore and stroke of 63 by 64. The standard Cub made 10 horsepower at 6,000 RPM claimed, in fact only 2 horsepower more than the earlier Terrier, but enough for a top speed of around 65 miles an hour, thanks to the 4-speed gearbox, a feature found on surprisingly few smaller machines of that time. Initially the Cub used the Terrier's plunger frame chassis. This was upgraded in 1957 to a full swinging arm job. A further development was the moving of the points to a mounting behind the cylinder. Now this looks rather like a distributor, but of course it isn't. There is only the one cylinder after all. 1961 would be a very significant year for the Cub. It would see the introduction of the Trials model and a Scrambles model, a bike really intended for the US market. This dispensed with a nacelle around the headlamp and used a more conventional setup, but also featured a 9:1 compression ratio on the piston, replacing the old 7:1 job on the original model. And this would raise power from 10 horsepower to 14.5. 1965 would see further upgrades with a beefed up bottom end and a folding kickstart on the sports and competition Cubs, and a new front fork which had actually previously been used on the Bonneville models. But this was probably a high point for the Cub, because BSA Group were moving away from the production of small bikes. The last Tiger Cubs would share much of its running gear and chassis with the BSA Bantam, before Tiger Cub production was stopped completely in 1968. The Aiel Colt 200. Now Aiel had been one of the great pioneers of the early British motorcycle industry, the company being founded by James Starley in 1870, and they would follow with their first motorcycle in 1902. Now a key figure in the Aiel story is of course Val Page, and he designed a 250cc overhead valve sporty engine in the late 20s, which was used right up until the early 30s and formed the basis for the first Colt models. However, the Colt 250 did not return at the end of World War II. However, in 1951, Aiel was sold to the BSA group. So in 1954, it was decided to produce a new Aiel Colt, but this time as a 200cc bike based on the C12 250 BSA. The new Colt had an overhead valve 197cc engine with a bore and stroke of 60 by 70. Compression ratio was a fairly modest 7.5 to 1, and overall power wasn't exactly spectacular. The top speed was around 62 miles an hour, and there was a 4-speed gearbox. The Colt was a nice, neatly styled little bike. However, few changes were ever made to the bike, as after just 5 years in production, it was replaced by the Leader and Arrow models in 1959. The Ambassador 3-Star Special. Ambassador, an interesting choice for a name, conjuring up as it does glamour and intrigue, maybe even Ferrero Rocher chocolates, but not necessarily a name that you would immediately think to use for a small Villiers commuter bike. Now, the Ambassador Motorcycle Company was founded in 1947 by one K. Don. Now, to describe K. Don as a colourful character is a masterpiece of English understatement, and definitely a subject worth covering in greater detail at some point later. Now, the 3-Star Special used a Villiers 197cc engine. Initially this was a non-unit engine, although later models would of course employ the unit construction motors in the 1960s. However, whichever engines used is of course a single-cylinder piston-ported, air-cooled 2-stroke unit. Earlier models would have plunge suspension, while later would have proper swinging arm suspension and a 4-speed rather than 3-speed gearbox. Performance was not surprisingly modest, with a top speed somewhere between 55 and 60 miles an hour, to cruise at around 45. Production of the 3-Star Special would survive the sale of the company in 1962, but would end just 2 seasons later. The Francis-Barnett Fulmer. Francis-Barnett was founded by one Gordon Francis and his father-in-law Arthur Bennett. Their early machines pioneered the use of a simple bolt-up frame which was very rapid to construct and of course extremely easy to repair. Various engines were fitted from Jap, Blackburn and of course most significantly Villiers 2-strokes. And the company would be largely synonymous with the use of Villiers 2-strokes, well, until they were taken over by AMC, who in the late 50s forced them to abandon the Villiers engines in favour of an all-new Piatti designed unit. Now, I won't go into the full Piatti engine saga here, but the Fulmer was the last all-new Francis-Barnett motorcycle when it was released in 1962, and of course it does use a 150cc version of that Piatti engine. This was mounted into a spine frame which was all new, and a new suspension system at the front which would be familiar to any Honda 50 Cub owner. But of course the most obvious feature was that wraparound bodywork which goes around the seat, around the real tank which is mounted underneath, and all the way around the front headlamp. It's clearly inspired by the Aiel Arrow, and I think gives the machine a nice, modern, fresh appearance. And the low-slung engine gave the bike a very low centre of gravity, so moving it around was very easy, and it was quite nimble too. Unfortunately, the Piatti engine was not powerful. Performance was pretty modest, and the timing of the bike's release couldn't have been worse, with parent company AMC going out of business just 4 years later. So, what other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us feature? Maybe you got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.